Good morning, everyone. That was such a dull good morning. I know Arun already prepped us. Can we do a louder good morning? I know the topic might sound very heavy or intellectual or confusing, okay? But I have tried my best to keep it as simple as possible, definitely with God's help. And thank you, Arun, for praying. So the topic for today is called Science, Ethics, and Faith. I know when the series was introduced, we had the topics as science and creation, science and ethics. But I wanted to have the word faith also in it because when I was preparing for it, I think that word really is the core of everything that we're going to talk today. Okay, so a little bit different compared to all the other times when we had messages where, we start with a Bible passage for reading. Today, there'll be a couple of verses and passages that I will be going through. And as I walk you through this topic on science, ethics, and faith, we will be reading those passages together. So don't be surprised if I ask the mic to be passed around for someone to loudly read the message, read the verse, or else I'll have a little more mercy on you and maybe I'll just read it. Oh, okay. Anyway, so science, ethics, and faith. I just want to have the first slide to be up. Yeah. So when you look at this image, what is it that comes to your mind? There's one person sailing on a ship, and there are a group of people who have gone for hiking. So imagine you were in one of the ship there, or probably you went for hiking, and I think there are two ways of traveling in such places, right? Because it's a vast area. It's a vast place. Sea is so vast. And so is a place like where you choose to hike. Would you go with a sense of direction? Or would you go as somebody who just wants to explore, so you would just go with the flow? I mean, there is no right or wrong answer here, but I'm sure there are different kinds of people here who define adventure for themselves. So would you like to be an explorer going just without any direction, or would you want a direction? Direction. Anyone here who doesn't prefer to have a direction and just go with the flow? Somewhere, okay. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, as long as you know how to get back from where you started. But the reason I'm using this example is, our life is also like this vast sea or a terrain which goes in multiple directions. And we can live it with a thought that, okay, do I know where I am going? Do I want to know where I'm going? Or do I just go with the flow and reach wherever the waves of life take me? There are two ways of looking at it. There are people who consider that, no, they need a sense of direction. They need to know the path that is laid, and they want to have a navigation with them that'll help them reach where they want to go. But there are also people who are okay to not have a navigation, not have a compass, and just go as life takes them. I'm not here to tell which of them is right or wrong here. But the reason I'm using this example is because when we talk about the word ethics, if you go to the next slide, ethics actually is a set of principles that helps us decide what is right, what is wrong, in terms of society where we live in, okay? Now, we have business ethics, we have financial ethics, we have cultural ethics, we have spiritual ethics, okay? And when I was preparing for this, and even as I was reading a couple of resources. Now, ethics for some people could be termed as something which is very absolute. Like there is just one right, one wrong. And for some people, ethics could be just relative because it depends on the culture from where they are brought up with, traditions that they have been influenced with. And that could determine, how a person decides what is right and what is wrong. Now, if I were to just differentiate ethics as whether it's relative or absolute, when I was writing down a list of ethical values that I would consider absolute is taking someone's life, right? Now, that is something which is considered illegal in any court of law. That's why we have law against anyone who commits a murder, right? There is a set of consequences that someone has to pay if somebody has murdered, whatever was the reason for that murder. But when it comes to relative ethics, ethics that could be relative based on our culture and traditions, now in some cultures, it is believed that a woman, when she's going through a menstrual cycle, she cannot participate in any holy ceremonies, okay? But there is another set of culture and tradition where they don't consider that as something unholy. Like a woman can be on a menstrual cycle and still participate in any holy ceremonies. Another relative ethical point could be some cultures prohibit eating animal meat. Some cultures, according to some cultures and traditions, people are vegetarian. They don't prefer to have anything considered to anything living, where they have to kill something and eat. And in some traditions and cultures, it's okay to have animal meat. And that also can determine your ethics, right? There are people who stand for going full vegan. And then there are people who stand for animal rights. So, a lot of things, right? And in this society that we live in this place that we live in, what decides, who gets to decide what is right and what is wrong? Who gets to decide, who gets to take the final call and set the standards? And do we even need such a standard? Do we even need ethics to live in a society which is now driven by so much of science, technology, advancement? And of course, faith also comes into the picture for certain community of people. And there are certain community of people who don't want to acknowledge the existence of faith, right? So the first question to address here, do we need an ethical or a moral law? Do we really need it? And if we do need it, where does it come from? Who set the rules there? Do we set it based on whatever we understand? Or was there something divine, someone divine who defined it for humanity? That's the bigger question to answer here. So the first question, do we really need it? Now, I'm not going to give this answer for each one of you, but if I take myself back to the image that I showed about if I'm sailing in a ship in a vast sea, okay, I'm a person who would, I would be on the ship because I know I want to reach somewhere through that ship on that sea. And if I have to reach a particular destination, I need a compass. I need a navigation tool to tell me, okay, this is the right direction to go or this is the wrong direction to go. I mean, I could definitely reach where I want to reach after exploring, but, well, if there is a purpose for me to be there on that particular spot and reach there at a certain amount of time, it's better for me to have a compass. And when it comes to life that we are living in, if I were to believe that there is a purpose for me to exist on this earth, and I will have eternal consequences for the choices I make, I would like to have a moral compass. But where does that moral compass come from? And did God define it for us? Or did we define it for people? Because as we evolved, right from whatever place we started, did it evolve with time, with tradition, cultures, and understanding and education? So I would like to read to you Romans chapter 7, verses 21 to 25. Yeah. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For my inner being, I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am! Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ. So then I myself in my mind am a slave to God's law, but in my sinful nature a slave to the law of sin. When we read this passage, I think whether we believe in a God or not, whether we believe in faith or not, I don't think we can deny the struggle that you and I go through each time we have to take a decision or make a choice in life. Whether it's about even being loyal in a relationship. Why is it that loyalty is considered so important in a relationship, and when someone fails to be loyal, we consider that as unfair? And this truth is universal. This truth does not just come from biblical values, right? I mean, anyone who's a non-believer also expects loyalty in a relationship. Where does that thought come from? And the struggle that someone faces when they are making a decision, that if I were to take a decision of saving a life or letting that life go, which many doctors actually were put in a place during the time of COVID, because I know a friend of mine who lost his mother because they couldn't find a bed. They couldn't find, place in the ICU, and she was there in a general ward. Her oxygen was dropping. It was 38. And he was pleading to the doctor on call there, because there were like 20, 30 people in that entire floor of general ward. It was just made a general ward in that hospital in Delhi. And her oxygen was dropping to 38. And then there was another patient whose oxygen was 70. And my friend just pleaded to the doctor that, can you please give her an oxygen cylinder? And he didn't know what to do, because they were short on oxygen cylinders. And he said, I have no choice but to save the one whom I know who will survive. And the doctor had to give the oxygen cylinder to the one who had oxygen levels at 70 instead of my friend's mother, who was just dipping to 38 and finally lost her life. So these choices, where does it stem from? And as I was trying to even wrestle, and now I've grown up in Christian faith. I've grown up in a Christian family. So it was embedded in me as I was born and grew up that, it's God whom we look up to, and it's God who sets all the standards for us. So as I lived through my life, I took decisions considering that what he thinks right is right for me, and everything else is not part of it. But I also grew up and then took on a profession to be in the field of science, to be a researcher, where I had the privilege to actually work with cells, work on brain, and even understand how a human brain works, that if anything goes wrong in it, it can just lead to the most lethal form of cancer called brain tumors. So as I grew up, there was a time in my life where I thought, do I truly believe in what I'm actually believing in? Or is there a contradiction, Is there something that I'm missing? And if we read Romans chapter 2, verses 14 to 15, it says, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their conscience are also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them." So here Paul is actually trying to say that Gentiles who actually did not know the law. And what was the law? Here he's talking about the 10 Commandments, the law that God gave to Moses. They didn't know it. Yet, the way they enacted showed that they had their laws written inside their hearts. So that means when God created us, he created us and he instilled these values in us, in us, because that is what he is. And Romans chapter 13, verses 9 to 10 goes on to say, "The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be, are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And there's one more verse which says that, I'm just missing this. Okay. Yeah, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22. I don't think that will be there on the screen. But yeah, there's another verse that says that we know that covetousness, do not covet, is like, because there is a law that you should not covet, you know that when I start envying something for something that I don't have, it is wrong, because there is a law that exists, right? And the point that I'm trying to make here is that we know that something is right or wrong because there is a moral law that exists. And that moral law, we cannot negate that it did not come from someone who, it did not come from the God above who created us. There's this book that I've been reading, and I did read because it's quite an inspiring book, and I do recommend you to read it. It's called The Language of God. It's called The Language of God, and it was written by a scientist called Francis Collins. Not sure how many of you have heard about him, but he's one of the leading scientists who actually led the Human Genome Project, and he's the reason why today we know what every gene in our body leads to what kind of diseases, and it was a groundbreaking discovery. But he writes in this book that how he turned from an atheist to an agnostic to a believer. And the first thing that he wrestled with this is this of, whether a moral law exists or not. And he does quote C.S. Lewis, who quotes about the existence of moral law. And this is what he writes, that, "Let me stop here to point out that the conclusion that the moral law exists is in serious conflict with current postmodernist philosophy, which argues that there are no absolute rights or wrongs, and all ethical decisions are relative. If there is no absolute truth, can postmodernism itself be true? Indeed, if there is no right or wrong, then there is no reason to argue for the discipline of ethics in the first place. Others will object that the moral law is simply a consequence of evolutionary pressures." So, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the wrestle for morality, the wrestle for ethics continues to exist within us. And that is what even Paul is talking in Romans, that we continue to wrestle between doing right, and yet we fail to do what is right. And that's because our flawed nature, is constantly in conflict with the nature that God created with us, because God created us with this moral law in us. And some of you may agree with me on this or may not, but the point that I want to make today is that there is a moral law that exists, and that moral law comes from God, comes from faith. But in all of this, when we live in a world where everything is moving with medicine and science and technology, how does all of this fit in? Because to add to this conflict of the right and wrong within us comes the advancement of science and technology, where medicine is just moving in such a fast pace that it has the ability to control life and death. Now, when I make this statement that medicine has the ability to control life and death, I know it could be contradictory to what we believe as believers, that life and death is actually in God's hands. But medicine has come to this level that today we can abort a conception, we can abort when we choose not to have that pregnancy. We can choose to actually conceive at any biological clock today because of a term called in vitro fertilization, where now at least we have the liberty to choose, okay, what age do I want to conceive? If I don't want to conceive at an age where I am biologically, like as per my biological clock, this is how my body is going to take it. But this technique actually gives me the ability that, I mean, even if I turn 38, 40, I can still choose to conceive because of this technique. And then there are other advancements in medicine that helps us to control birth. Now, these are aspects where I think the church is divided, the society is divided, and even politics is divided, right? And when we talk about these aspects, how, as we church believers, how do we look at it? Do we want to fight over it? Do we want to legalize this? Or do we want to look at it from the way how God would want us to see? Speaking in lines of this topic, I think when it comes to ethics, there were so many topics that I wanted to actually bring forth, but this is something which is so prevalent today that we have debates, we have protests, we have people standing up against for it, for it. And when I was actually preparing for this message, I didn't realize I had a story related to this. So I had a very close friend of mine, don't want to name her, very close friend of mine who was in a relationship, a very tumultuous relationship, where it wasn't even committed, it wasn't even going to lead to marriage, but she was. And it was a physically intimate relationship that she was in. And one day, she was actually afraid that she probably would be pregnant. And this was early in her career, quite young. And that's when she sat down, like, first, she didn't want to share this with anybody. And then one day she did tell me that, I think I could be pregnant, and I'm just too scared to even go take that test. Now, that was my first experience actually being with somebody who's actually in that place, Growing up, I've just learned, okay, a life is important. You can't just take it for granted. Certain values are important, and you've got to follow it. And here I was sitting with a close friend of mine at that juncture of her life where she was like, I don't know what I'm going to do if it comes positive. And then I asked her the most difficult question. The guy who she was with was not going to commit to her and had already told her that he's not going to have a future with her. And she knew that it was just going to be her alone. And with a rising career, I said, what would you want to do if it comes positive? Do you want to keep it or not? Because we did go to the gynae, and she said, take this test, whatever it is, you are quite young, because the doctor said, I mean, it's not going to be very late and we can, go through medical procedures, so you don't have to be worried about it. And yet, she sat there with tears and heaviness. And when I asked her this question, she said, if it comes yes, I don't think I will have the courage to not keep it. No matter how hard it is, I may go for it. And I said, why do you think you want to keep that? I mean, you have a career in front of you. I mean, that child, if that child comes into this life, will be probably without a father. So many things, And believe me, I didn't go and preach to her that, okay, life is important, nothing of that sort. And she was not a believer. She said, it's a life that I'm talking about here. And how can I just make a decision for it? And that made me realize what made her take that call, because I put myself in her shoes. And I asked myself, if I was placed in that position, would I have had the courage to actually take that call? I probably would have, because that's where my faith would come in. And I told her that, what makes you take that courageous call? She said, I'm not a very strong believer in God, but this situation just makes me believe there is somebody above me, and I can't take that decision for a life here. And that teared me up. I prayed for her. First time we walked into a chemist, just took that pregnancy kit. And as much as we both were wrestling with, societal norms and, we looked younger compared to our age. So when we went to buy that kit, of course, there were judgmental looks given by that chemist person. And I asked her to take that test, and I just prayed for her. I said, God, I don't know how we're going to deal with this, how she will deal with it, but I hope you are watching. And thankfully, it was negative. It was negative. It was a false alarm. But that entire situation just, made this thing so real that we could be placed in situations like where we are having to take some really difficult decisions. What gives us the strength to take the decision, thinking what is right and what is wrong? And we cannot negate that a moral law exists there. So, I know I'm speaking a lot of things here. I promise to summarize so that we know what we have to take back from this talk of mine today. That when God designed us, He did give us the sense of right and wrong. And I cannot negate what the scripture says here. In Proverbs chapter 21, verses 2 to 3, which says, a person may think their own ways are right, but the Lord weighs the heart. To do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Matthew chapter 7, verses 12 says, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. This verse, do to others what you would have done, what you would have them do to you, is so much, I think, this is the core of ethics, I feel. I have not gone and read other religion books, but this makes so much sense. And when Christ came and redefined the laws of Moses, we know the 10 Commandments, right? Which says, do not murder, do not lie, do not commit adultery. But when Jesus came in, he didn't just say, don't commit adultery, but he also said, we should avoid entertaining even the thought of it. When the law of Moses said that you should not steal and not envy what others have, Jesus said that we should focus our lives on God and not on earthly possessions. Jesus went deeper than just the law. And because of Christ, this war that we wage in with, every single day, that should I do right? Is this right or wrong? Can I do it? I want to do the right thing, but I don't have the strength in my flesh to do it. That's the strength which Christ gives, because that's the strength which comes in after understanding that we are flawed people, and we are born with that sinful nature. And the only way to overcome that is through Christ. I said a lot of things here, some of it which probably would have gone bouncer. But there's a video that I would like you all to listen to. And this comes, again, from this person who wrote this book, Francis Collins. And I don't think, the way he's just defined moral laws, I think it's something worth listening to. And I hope this really helps.
If you were looking not just for evidence of a God who was a mathematician and a physicist, but a God who cared about human beings and who stood for what was good and holy and wanted his people to also be interested in what is good and holy, wouldn't it be interesting to find written in your own heart this moral law which doesn't otherwise make sense and which is calling you to do just that? That made a lot of sense to me. So after going through these arguments over the course of a couple of years, and it was that long, fighting them, oftentimes wishing that I had never started down this road because it was leading me a place I wasn't sure I wanted to go, I began to realize that I had a certain series of immutable issues that were leading me in the direction of awe of something greater than myself. Reflected here by this phrase from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. Two things fill me with constantly increasing admiration and awe. The longer and more earnestly I reflect on them, the starry heavens without and the moral law within. My goodness, that's just where I was. But I had to figure out then, okay, if there is the possibility of this kind of God and a God who cares about humans, what is that God really like? And now it was time to go back to the world's religions and try to figure out what they tell us about that. And as I read through them, now somewhat better prepared, I could see there were great similarities between the great monotheistic religions, and they actually resonated quite well with each other about many of the principles, and I found that quite gratifying and was a bit surprised because I had assumed that they were radically different. But there were differences. Now, about this time, I had also arrived at a point that was actually not comforting, which was the realization that if the moral law was a pointer to God, and if God was good and holy, I was not. And as much as I tried to forgive myself for actions that were not consistent with that moral law, they kept popping up. And therefore, just as I was beginning to perceive the person of God in this sort of blurry way, that image was receding because of my own failures. And I began to despair of whether this would ever be a relationship that I could claim or hope to have because of my own shortcomings. And into that area of increasing anxiety came the realization that there is a person in one of these faiths who has the solution to that. And that's the person of Jesus Christ, who not only claimed to know God, but to be God, and who in this amazing and incomprehensible at first, but ultimately incredibly sensible, uplifting, sacrificial act, died on the cross and then rose from the dead to provide this bridge between my imperfections and God's holiness in a way that made more sense than I ever dreamed it could. I had heard those phrases about Christ died for your sins, and I thought that was so much gibberish, and suddenly it wasn't gibberish at all. And so, 2 years after I began this journey, on a hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains up in Oregon, with my mind cleared of those distractions that so often get in the way of realizing what is really true and important, I felt I had reached the point where I no longer had reasons to resist, and I didn't want to resist. I had a hunger to give in to this. And so that day, I became a Christian. That was 31 years ago. And I was scared, and I was afraid I was going to turn into somebody very somber and lose my sense of humor and probably be called to Africa the next week or something, but instead I discovered this great sense of peace and a joyfulness about having finally crossed that bridge. And also to have done so in a fashion that seemed to live up to my hopes that faith would not be something you had to plunge into blindly, but something where there was, in fact, reason behind the decision. And I guess I should have known, because as I began to learn a bit more about the Bible, I encountered this verse in Matthew where Jesus is being questioned about which is the greatest commandment in the law. The Pharisees here trying to trap Jesus into saying something they can point out as being inconsistent with the Old Testament. And Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." Wow, there it was, all your mind. We're supposed to use our minds when it comes to faith.
The reason I just played this video is also because it comes from a very eminent scientist who probably had every reason to believe that, ethics, morals are beyond, because he's the one who discovered human genetics. And so easy, because we have the knowledge of so many things in what's happening inside our body, and we can just twist and turn it and just do whatever we want with that knowledge. But there has to be a moral compass, and that cannot be negated. So to summarize, is there a moral law that exists? According to me, yes. From where does that moral law come? Is it something that is within us, or is it something that stems from our cultures and traditions? By faith, I can say that that moral law comes from God within us. And if I actually have to go into science, he also has a Christian advocacy group forum called Biologos, and I will share the link with you. There are a group of neuroscientists and neurobiology where we know that there is a part of the brain that actually decides our moral behaviors. It's not something that's coming out of the blue. So even like if I have to put faith and science together, the way God designed our brains, which is one of the most complicated organs of a human body, and which actually decides our identity, the way it is created, there is a part of the brain called the frontal lobe, which actually decides and controls our moral behaviors, okay? And these behaviors, yes, they can be influenced by our external environments and spaces that we are. But just the way our neurons are made, there is something called neuroplasticity, where even if our nerves have been conditioned to fire in a certain manner, there is a way to rewire that brain, those neuron firing, and it's called neuroplasticity. And that requires a lot of transformation, renewal, and it's not just medicines who take care of that rewiring. That also requires a lot of, that's why people go for, why is counseling required? Why is therapy required? But when we have counseling and therapy and we negate the existence of the influence of God, the pieces of the puzzle don't come together, according to me. And this is where I just cannot put science and faith in two different buckets and say that, okay, ethics is something that I choose to believe and it doesn't come from anywhere. Ethics is not the center. The image that John and Junie used for the sermon theme, can you just have that, John? So when I was preparing for this message, trust me, I went with the thought, okay, here is ethics. How am I going to put faith and science, and how am I going to tie that together? It's on WhatsApp. Okay. If you go back to the image that is there on WhatsApp about the series about science, faith, and ethics, there's an image, right, of how it's like there is a fulcrum there, something at the center, and then there are two parts to it. When I started off, I thought ethics was right at the center, and there is science that influences it and faith that influences it. But I actually want to conclude. I don't know if you will agree with me. I think faith stands right at the center. Then comes ethics, and then comes science. And that is, if we believe in a God who is living, if we believe in the blood of Christ, if we believe in his resurrection, I think faith comes right at the center. And we can have all the knowledge that we have. And we don't have to negate the knowledge that comes through science. In fact, Steve also brought this point last week that science is just a way to know the way. Actually, after being a researcher, I'll tell you there were days, barring all the failed experiments, but then there were days I would be dumbstruck looking at that cell culture dish, just the way those cells moved under a microscope and how they had the ability to, even those cancer cells, how they had the ability to just destroy the entire body because they're not working the way they're supposed to work. I mean, that's amazing. We can understand, we can try to, delineate the pathways, the metabolic pathways by which every cell functions. But everything comes to a point that there's something more divine there that controls all of it. And for that, we need to have faith. And if you remove that, we will be like the sailors on that ship, just going with the flow, how the waves are taking. I mean, we'll reach wherever it takes us. But the question that I want to ask all of you is, where do we want to reach? Do we want to believe in this? What do you choose to believe? And if you choose to believe in this moral law, do you want to stand for it? Do you want to stand for it? And when I say stand for it, I'm not asking you to go outside with placards and protests and stand against the government and, voice out, this is legal, that is not legal. No, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm actually asking you to stand the way Jesus asked us to stand. And when he said, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. 1 John chapter 3, verse 18 says, Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. And when I say truth, if we understand what is right and what is wrong, it should show in our actions and not just words. And that's a choice for each one of us to make. And it's going to be a different choice for all of us, Some of us may be called to just stand for someone's justice. Just be there for someone who is going through something probably that was not right. And you know that it was not right. What are you doing there after knowing and understanding that there is a moral law that exists? And I just want to leave you with this question. I hope the points that I brought out, if there's one thing that you can go back with today is that, and ask yourself, what do I want to believe in? What are my standards? And do I want to stand for those standards? Amen.